The notice was 3 lines. James Ashworth, Duke of Windham, died in service. No memorial service will be held. Eleanor read it once. Her aunt swept the paper away. Neither of them said a word. 3 hours later, the dead man's brother walked through the door, and he was smiling. She had seen Richard Ashworth once before. A cousin's wedding 6 years ago. He had not looked at her then. He did not quite look at her now. His eyes moved around the room in the way of men who are always calculating the value of things they are standing inside. He did not sit down. He was holding a folder. "I need someone for Windham," he said. "My late brother's estate, Shropshire. The accounts are a disaster, the tenants are behind, and I can't be bothered with it personally." He set the folder on the table. "I need someone discreet." Eleanor looked at the folder, then at him. Why me? It was the one question she allowed herself. "Your family?" he said. "Distant. But it looks better that way." He opened the folder, slid a single page across the table, a contract, salary at the bottom, the words temporary arrangement underlined. Eleanor read it. Then she turned the page over because she'd seen, just at the edge, just before his hand moved to cover it, another document underneath. Handwritten. 4 words. Not to be disclosed. She looked up. Richard was watching her with the stillness of a man who has just shown something he didn't mean to. "The salary," he said very smoothly, "is modest but reliable." He did not mention the document. She did not ask. She picked up the pen and signed. Later, much later, she would understand that this was the moment. Not the midnight knock, not the carriage on the drive. This was the moment everything began. The pen in her hand. The document she had not been allowed to read. And her own silence, chosen so quickly, it barely felt like a choice at all. She had not always been this way. There had been a time, she was perhaps 12, perhaps 13, when Eleanor Voss asked questions constantly. Her father called it her best quality. "You see things, Ellie," he used to say. "Don't ever stop seeing things." Her father died when she was 24. He left behind 2 debts, a house that had been mortgaged 3 times without her knowledge, and a letter of apology addressed to her that she read once and never opened again. She had not stopped seeing things. She had simply stopped saying them aloud. Her Aunt Harriet had taken her in. Harriet was her mother's sister, a woman who performed generosity the way other women perform piano. Technically accomplished, entirely without feeling. Every meal eaten at Harriet's table came with an unspoken ledger entry. Every dress borrowed, every fire shared. Every night sheltered under Harriet's roof added to a debt that was never named but always present. "You are not unattractive," Harriet told her once. "If you were less quiet, you might have had offers by now." Eleanor was 26. She had had one offer, from a solicitor's clerk who had wanted, it became clear, not a wife, but an unpaid secretary who would also manage his household. She had declined. Harriet had not spoken to her for 2 weeks. The morning Richard Ashworth came to call, Eleanor had been at Harriet's for 2 years. 2 years of borrowed dresses and careful silences and the particular exhaustion of being tolerated. She had no money, no property, no prospects that didn't involve further tolerance from further relatives. Richard Ashworth had walked into the sitting room and offered her a door. She had not asked what was behind it. She arrived at Windham on the 14th of October, 1843. The drive was longer than she expected. Nearly a mile from the gate, lined with elms that had not been trimmed in years. The carriage moved slowly. Eleanor watched the house appear through the trees in pieces. First a chimney, then a roof line, then the full face of it. Gray stone and tall windows, larger than anything she had managed before, larger than she had imagined when Richard said estate. She had managed nothing before. She did not say this to anyone. Mrs. Peel was waiting at the door, 60 years old, iron-haired, with the expression of a woman who had outlasted 3 families and expected to outlast a 4th. "Miss Voss," she said. "Mrs. Peel," said Eleanor. A pause. They looked at each other with the frankness of 2 women who have both been underestimated so many times that they no longer bother with pretense. "Your room is upstairs," said Mrs. Peel. "Supper is at 7. The ledgers are in the study." She turned and walked inside. Eleanor picked up her own trunk. The footman had already disappeared, and followed her in. The east wing was small, cold. The furniture had been covered with dust sheets, and the window looked out over the kitchen garden, which had gone entirely to seed. Eleanor set her trunk at the foot of the bed and opened it. 3 dresses. A wool coat that had been her mother's, a dictionary, a notebook she had bought herself the week before leaving, with the last coins from her own purse. And at the very bottom, wrapped in a handkerchief, her father's pocket watch. Stopped. She had never had it repaired. She wasn't sure why. She set the watch on the windowsill, then she went to the study and opened the ledgers. She had told herself she would look for an hour, understand the basics, begin properly in the morning. She was there until 2 o'clock. The accounts were not a disaster. That was the first thing she understood, and it unsettled her more than disorder would have. A disaster is accidental. What she was looking at was not accidental. Rents recorded as unpaid when she could see, in older entries, that the same tenants had paid reliably for years. Expenditures listed twice in different columns, in slightly different handwriting. A payment of £40 to an unnamed recipient, repeated quarterly, always on the 1st of the month. And then, precisely 18 months ago, stopping entirely. She turned back to the beginning and started again. At 2 o'clock, she closed the ledger, sat in the dark for a moment. Then she opened her new notebook, picked up her pen, and began to write down everything she had seen. Not because anyone had asked her to, because something in her, the part her father had named, the part that saw things, could not leave it alone. The first year was the hardest. Mrs. Peel watched her with open skepticism for 3 months. The tenants were polite in the way of people who expect you to leave soon. The house itself seemed to resist her. A pipe burst in November. A section of roof came away in a winter storm. The kitchen range failed on the coldest morning of January and could not be repaired for a week. Eleanor dealt with each thing as it came. She had no system at first. She made one. She walked the full property in the first week, every field, every tenant cottage, every outbuilding. She introduced herself to everyone she met. She wrote their names in her notebook, their names and the names of their children and the names of their animals and whatever they told her about the land. Old Daniel Marsh, who had farmed the North Field for 30 years, told her the drainage was wrong. Had been wrong since the previous Duke's time, he said. The one before this one. Water pooled every spring. Ruined a third of the crop reliably. Has anyone been told? Eleanor asked. Daniel Marsh looked at her the way people look when they have given up expecting to be heard. Every year, he said. Eleanor had the drainage rerouted by April. It cost less than the quarterly loss from the ruined crops. She did not ask Richard's permission. She told him in a letter afterward, one paragraph, factual, no apology. He did not respond. She took that as agreement. The second year she found them. 5 families who had been removed from their cottages 18 months before her arrival. Dismissed, Richard's agent had told them, for non-payment of rent. But Eleanor had the ledgers. She had the older entries. These families had paid. She wrote to Richard. His response came 3 weeks later. 2 lines. The matter was handled appropriately. Please do not correspond with former tenants. Eleanor read the letter twice, folded it, put it in the notebook. Then she wrote to the families. They came back in March. She had the cottages repaired before they arrived. Mrs. Peel, who had watched all of this without comment, left a pot of soup outside Eleanor's door the evening they returned. No note. Eleanor ate it standing at the window, watching the lights come on in the cottages across the yard. She did not cry. She was not sure why she felt like she might. The third year she found the account. It was in an older ledger, not the current books, but a set she had found in a locked cabinet in the study, the key taped to the underside of a desk drawer. She had nearly missed it. A savings account, opened in the Duke's name, never touched, accumulating interest since 1839. She sat with it for a long time. It was enough to repair the south wing. The south wing had been closed since before her arrival, shutters nailed shut. 2 rooms with collapsed ceilings, a staircase Mrs. Peel would not let anyone use. She wrote to Richard. He did not respond. She repaired the south wing. By autumn it was open. Mrs. Peel moved her sitting room into the larger room on the 2nd floor. She did not ask permission either. Eleanor noticed and said nothing. One afternoon, she could not have said what made her do it. Eleanor walked into the Duke's old study on the south side, the one that had been sealed longest, and opened the shutters. The light came in thick and golden and smelling of dust. There was a desk, a chair, a shelf of books, geography, history, one slim volume of poetry with a name written inside the front cover in a careful hand. James Ashworth, 1836. He would have been, she calculated, perhaps 17. She put the book back exactly where she had found it. She stood at the window for a while, looking out at the grounds she had spent 3 years rebuilding. She thought, this is the closest I will ever come to owning something. Then she went back to work. The 4th year, the letters stopped. Not gradually, abruptly. Richard had written in January, brief, formal, a question about a tenant lease. She answered. He did not reply. February passed. March. She wrote once in April about a repair to the mill. Nothing. In June, the salary did not arrive. Eleanor noted it in her ledger. June. Payment absent. She waited. July. Nothing. She wrote to Richard. 1 sentence. The June and July payments have not arrived. Please advise. No response. In August, she stopped taking her own salary. She did not announce this. She simply stopped recording it as an expenditure and moved the money into the estate accounts. Mrs. Peel found out within a week. Eleanor was not sure how. "This isn't right," Mrs. Peel said. She was standing in the kitchen doorway. She had the expression she wore when she was about to say something she had decided to say regardless of consequences. "Everything is fine," Eleanor said. "It is not fine," said Mrs. Peel. "You are paying the staff from your own pocket. I am managing the accounts." Eleanor. It was the first time Mrs. Peel had used her name in 4 years. Eleanor looked at her. Mrs. Peel looked back. "I know," Eleanor said quietly. "I know it isn't fine." She turned back to the ledger. Mrs. Peel stayed in the doorway for a moment longer, then left without speaking. In September, a man arrived from London. He came on a Wednesday, unannounced, with a leather satchel and the manner of someone performing a routine task. He said he was from Richard's solicitor's office. He needed to review the accounts. Eleanor showed him to the study. She gave him the current ledgers, the ones she maintained, clean, accurate, fully documented. She did not give him the older ledgers. She did not give him her notebook. She did not mention the locked cabinet. She was not sure why she made these decisions. She made them in the space of 30 seconds, standing at the study door, watching the man settle into the chair with his satchel. Something, she thought. Something is ending. She went to the kitchen and told Mrs. Peel to make tea. That evening, after the man had left, she went through her files. The copies she had been keeping, quietly, without instruction, without reason, for 4 years. Duplicate receipts, duplicate correspondence, the older ledgers, her notebooks. She packed them into a box and put the box in the back of the linen cupboard. Then she sat down at the desk and looked at the stopped watch on the windowsill. James Ashworth, 1836. No memorial service will be held. She had been here 4 years. She had read that notice on the morning Richard came to her aunt's house. She had seen the document he had covered with his hand. She had found the 5 families dismissed for rents they had paid. She had found the account no one had told her about. She had watched the letters stop and the salary stop, and a man arrive to look at her books. She had seen all of it. She had not asked a single question. On the night of the 14th of November, 1847, Eleanor was at the desk in the study. The south wing study, the one with a window and the shelf of books, when she heard it. Wheels on the drive. She looked up. The clock on the mantel said 12 minutes past midnight. She sat very still and listened. The wheels slowed, stopped. A door opened. The carriage door, she could tell by the sound. Footsteps on gravel. One set, coming toward the house. Mrs. Peel appeared in the doorway, candle in hand, hair loose, looking for the first time in 4 years, genuinely uncertain. "Miss Voss," she said. "I heard," said Eleanor. She picked up her candle. She walked to the front door. She stood there for a moment, her hand on the iron handle, the cold coming through the wood. The footsteps stopped now on the other side. And she thought, "You have spent 4 years not asking. Ask." She opened the door. He was taller than she expected. She was not sure why she had expected anything. She had never seen him, had no portrait to reference, nothing but a name written in a book in a careful 17-year-old's hand. But she had spent 4 years inside his house, and houses tell you things about the people who built them. The study with its geography books and its single slim volume of poetry. The drainage system Daniel Marsh had complained about for 30 years that the previous Duke had ignored, and this one had apparently intended to fix. She had found the notes, in the same careful handwriting, in the back of one of the older ledgers. Northfield. Drainage. Consult Marsh. Spring. He had written that note in 1842. He had left for the continent in the spring of 1843. He had never come back to ask Marsh about the drainage. She had fixed it herself, in his absence, without knowing why it felt important. Now he was standing in her doorway, tall, thinner than the door frame suggested he should be. The thinness of a man who has been somewhere food was not reliable. Dark hair, longer than fashion permitted, pushed back from a face that was weathered in the way of men who have spent time outdoors without choosing to. He was wearing a coat that had once been good quality and was now held together largely by habit. His boots were wrong for the weather. His eyes were looking past her, into the house, the way a man looks at something he thought he had lost. "This is my house," he said. His voice was quiet, not threatening. The particular quietness of someone who has rehearsed a sentence so many times it has lost its edges. Eleanor held the candle up. She looked at him for a long moment. "The Duke of Windham," she said, "is dead." "Yes," he said. "I've been told." She did not let him in immediately. Later she would think about this. The fact that she had stood in the doorway of his house, in the cold, at midnight, and made him wait. She was not sure what she had been waiting for. Some instinct, perhaps. The same instinct that had made her keep the older ledgers. The same instinct that had made her move the box to the linen cupboard. "Proof," she said. He looked at her, a long look, assessing, and then, unexpectedly, almost something like respect. He reached into his coat. His hands, she noticed, were not steady, not the tremor of fear, but of cold, of exhaustion, of a body that had been pushed past what bodies are meant to sustain. He drew out a document. Folded, worn at the creases, the paper softened from long handling. He held it out. She took it, opened it, held it to the candle. It was a deed. The original deed to Windham Estate. Not a copy, not a solicitor's duplicate, but the original document, with the original seal and the original signature. James Robert Ashworth, Duke of Windham. The signature matched the one she had found in the older ledgers, in the back pages, in the careful handwriting that had noted the drainage problem in the north field. She looked at the deed for a long time. Then she looked at him. "Anyone could have taken this from the estate," she said. "Before my time." "Yes," he said. "They could have." He reached into his coat again. This time he produced something smaller, a ring. He held it flat on his palm, a signet ring, heavy gold, with the Windham crest pressed into the face. "It was my father's," he said, "and his father's before that. It has never left the family. It was on my hand when I left for France in March of 1843. He paused. "It was on my hand in the prison in Toulouse. It was on my hand when I crossed the Channel 2 weeks ago. I did not sleep the entire crossing because I was afraid someone would take it." Eleanor looked at the ring. She thought of the stopped watch on the windowsill, her father's. The one she had never had repaired. The one she kept because it was the last thing that proved he had existed. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. Mrs. Peel took one look at him and went directly to the kitchen. Eleanor led him to the study, the south wing study, the one she had opened 3 years ago, the one with his books. She set her candle on the desk. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the room for a moment without speaking. His eyes went to the bookshelf. She watched him find the poetry volume. She watched something move across his face, quick, controlled, the expression of a man who has taught himself not to feel things in front of people. He did not touch the book. He looked away. "Sit down," Eleanor said. He sat. He moved like someone in pain, carefully, with the awareness of a body that had learned to expect the worst from simple actions. Mrs. Peel arrived with bread and cold meat and a pot of tea, and she set it on the desk without looking at either of them. and she left without speaking. Eleanor poured the tea. She set a cup in front of him. He wrapped both hands around it. They sat in silence for a moment. The fire was low. Eleanor added wood to it without asking. "How long," she said, "were you in Toulouse?" 3 years and 8 months. "And before that?" "Paris. 6 months." He looked at the fire. "I was captured in April of 1843, 3 weeks after I arrived on the continent." 3 weeks. She had arrived at Windham in October of 1843. By then, he had already been a prisoner for 6 months. By then, Richard had already had the death certificate. By then, the not-to-be-disclosed document had already been written. "Your brother," she said carefully, "told me you died of a fever. Somewhere in France." James looked at her. "My brother," he said, "knew exactly where I was." The silence that followed was not empty. Eleanor sat with what he had said. She turned it over, looked at it from the sides, set it against everything she had seen in 4 years. The manipulated ledgers, the dismissed families, the quarterly payment that had stopped 18 months before her arrival. The document Richard had covered with his hand. "The death certificate," she said. "Purchased," he said. "There was a captain in the British consulate in Paris, a man named Fallow. He had debts. Richard has always been very good at finding men with debts." "How do you know this?" "Because I was there," he said quietly. "I was in Paris when it happened. I saw Fallow. I tried to reach him. I had been moved between 3 holding locations in 6 months. I had managed to get 1 letter out to a friend in London, but it never arrived. Or it arrived and was intercepted. I don't know which." He paused. "When I finally understood what Richard had done, what he had arranged, I stopped trying to send letters." "Why?" He looked at her directly for the first time. "Because if Richard knew I was trying to communicate, he would have made certain I never left Toulouse." Eleanor held his gaze. She believed him. She was not sure if she should trust that she believed him. She had spent 4 years believing Richard's silence was merely neglect, and she had been wrong about that. But there was something in the way this man spoke that was entirely without performance. He was not trying to convince her. He was simply telling her what had happened, the way one reports facts to someone who needs them. "The estate," she said. "What has he taken?" Something shifted in his expression. He had not expected that question. Not that question. Not in that order. "I don't know yet," he said. "I came here first. I needed—" He stopped, started again. "I needed somewhere that wasn't London. Somewhere Richard wouldn't expect." "He has men watching this estate," Eleanor said. "One came in September, from the solicitor's office." James went very still. "What did you give him?" "The current ledgers." "And?" She looked at him steadily. "That's all I gave him." The fire shifted. A log settled. James looked at her, and this time the look was different from all the ones before. Not assessing, not exhausted. Something quieter than either of those things. "You kept copies," he said. It was not quite a question. "I keep records of everything," Eleanor said. "I always have." She showed him the box at 2 in the morning. She brought it from the linen cupboard and set it on the desk between them. He went through it slowly. The duplicate receipts, the correspondence, the older ledgers, her notebooks with their careful entries. He did not speak for a long time. She watched him read. She had never seen anyone read the way he did, with his whole body still and only his eyes moving. and the occasional slight tension in his jaw when he found something that confirmed what he already knew. He set down the third notebook and looked up. 4 years, he said. Yes. You kept records for 4 years, without instruction, without... He stopped. Why? Eleanor considered the question. Because something was wrong, she said, and I wanted to be able to prove it, if it ever became necessary. Did you know what was wrong? Not entirely. Not until tonight. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the box, at 4 years of meticulous, dated, signed evidence of his brother's systematic theft. Miss Voss, he said. Yes. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, even if the answer is not what either of us would prefer. She waited. Is there anything in these records, he said slowly, that could be used against you? Any decision you made, any expenditure, anything that Richard could point to and say was unauthorized or improper? Eleanor thought of the 5 families, the south wing repair, the drainage, the account she had found and spent without asking permission. She thought of the salary she had stopped paying herself. Yes, she said. James nodded, as if he had expected this. Then we have a problem, he said, because Richard is going to try to use it. She had almost gone back to bed. That was the thing she kept returning to in the days that followed. She had almost not opened the door. She had stood in the hallway with her hand on the iron handle, and she had thought, whatever is on the other side of this door will cost you something. She had opened it anyway. And now she was sitting at a dead man's desk at 3 a.m. with a dead man across from her, who was very much alive, going through 4 years of evidence that his brother had committed fraud on a scale she was only beginning to fully comprehend. The stopped watch was on the windowsill. She looked at it. Don't ever stop seeing things. She looked back at the man across the desk. Tell me tonight, she said. Everything. He talked until dawn. She did not interrupt. She sat with her notebook open and her pen moving, and she wrote down everything he said. Dates, names, locations, the sequence of events from his arrival in Paris in March of 1843 to the night he had finally walked out of a prison in Toulouse by means he described briefly and without elaboration, and the 2 weeks of travel across France and the Channel crossing, and the long road north to Shropshire. Captain Fallow of the British Consulate in Paris. The death certificate dated August 1843. The solicitor, a man named Graves, Richard's man, who had processed the inheritance with unusual speed. The London house, sold 18 months ago, the Derbyshire estate, transferred to a shell company whose ownership traced back, if you looked carefully enough, to Richard himself. How do you know about the transfers? Eleanor asked. I had a contact, he said. In London. Someone who had been watching Richard for reasons of his own. He got messages to me occasionally, through a network that I would rather not describe in detail. Is he still watching? He died in June, James said flatly. Influenza, or so I was told. Eleanor wrote, Contact, London, deceased June 1847. She looked at what she had written. Richard is very good, she said, at the deaths of inconvenient people. James said nothing. The fire had burned down again. Eleanor did not get up to add more wood. The room was cold and getting colder, and neither of them moved. The death certificate, Eleanor said. Captain Fallow. Dead, said James. 2 years ago. The solicitor. Graves. Still practicing. still Richard's man. So the only living person who can confirm the certificate was fraudulent is me, James said. A man the English courts have declared legally dead. The word legally landed in the room and stayed there. Eleanor looked at her notebook, at his words in her handwriting, at 4 years of records in the box on the desk between them. "There is a way," she said slowly. He looked at her. "The older ledgers," she said. "The quarterly payments. The ones that stopped 18 months before I arrived. £40, first of every month, to an unnamed recipient." She turned to the page in her notebook where she had first recorded it 4 years ago. "I think that was fallow. I think Richard was paying him to stay quiet. And I think when Fallow died, the payments stopped because there was no longer anyone to pay." James stared at her. "If we can trace those payments," Eleanor continued, "to an account connected to Fallow, even a dead man's account, it corroborates the fraud. It is not testimony. It is a paper trail. And paper trails," she said quietly, "do not die of influenza." The silence stretched. "Miss Voss," James said. "Yes?" "How long did you say you had been managing this estate?" 4 years. He looked at the box, at the notebooks, at her. "Richard," he said, "made a very significant error." "He made several," Eleanor said. "But yes, sending me here was the largest." At 5:30 in the morning, Mrs. Peel knocked on the study door and entered without waiting for an answer. She set a fresh pot of tea on the desk. She looked at the box of documents. She looked at the man sitting across from Eleanor. She looked at Eleanor. "I'll make up the blue room," she said. "Mrs. Peel," Eleanor began. "The blue room," said Mrs. Peel firmly, "is the best room in the house. It has always been the Duke's room." She picked up the empty teapot. "It will be again." She left. James looked at the door she had closed behind her. "How long has she worked here?" he asked. "Since before you were born," Eleanor said. He was quiet for a moment. "She knew me," he said, "when I was a child." "I suspect," said Eleanor, "that she has been waiting 4 years for you to come home. She did not sleep." When James finally went upstairs, led by Mrs. Peel with a candle and the careful dignity of a woman reuniting something that had been separated too long, Eleanor stayed in the study. She sat at the desk. She looked at the box. She thought about what she had told him. Sending me here was the largest error. She had said it calmly. She had meant it. But sitting now in the quiet of the study, the fire dead, the dawn coming gray through the window, she understood something she had not fully understood in the hours of talking. Richard had not sent her here to manage an estate. Richard had sent her here to be the face on the estate. To be the respectable, quiet, unquestioning woman who lived in the house and signed the receipts and gave Richard's arrangement the appearance of ordinary, uneventful inheritance. She had been the alibi 4 years. She had spent 4 years being used as cover for the theft of a man's title, his property, his life. And she had done it quietly, without questions, exactly as she had been selected to do. The part that was worst, the part she sat with now, in the cold gray light, was that she had known. Not the details, not the full shape of it. But she had known, from the moment Richard covered that document with his hand, that something was wrong. She had known, and she had signed, and she had gone to Shropshire, and she had kept her head down, and she had been, for 4 years, exactly the woman Richard Ashworth needed her to be. She looked at the stopped watch on the windowsill. Don't ever stop seeing things. She had seen everything. She had simply chosen, over and over, not to speak. She picked up the watch, held it. Then she set it down, opened her notebook to a fresh page, and began to write. There was a great deal to do before Richard found out James was home. Richard arrived on a Thursday. Eleanor had known he would come. She had not known it would be so soon. 4 days, which meant someone on the estate had sent word to London within hours of James's arrival. She had thought about this possibility. She had not been able to prevent it without making the surveillance obvious, and making it obvious would have told Richard that she knew. So she had let it happen. She was in the front garden when his carriage came up the drive, not by accident. She had been watching the gate since morning. She watched the carriage stop, watched Richard step down. He was dressed for London, not the country. A deliberate choice, she understood now. He always dressed for wherever he wanted to appear to be in control. He looked at the house, then he looked at her. His expression did not change. That was the thing about Richard Ashworth. In 4 years, Eleanor had never seen his expression change in a way he had not chosen. He was the most legible, illegible man she had ever known. Everything he showed you was shown on purpose, which meant everything he showed you was false. "Miss Voss," he said. "Mr. Ashworth," she said. He walked toward her. His eyes moved across the front of the house. The repaired south wing, the trimmed elms, the kitchen garden that had been nothing but weeds when she arrived. "You've done well here," he said. It was not a compliment. It was an inventory. "Thank you," she said, as if it were. "I had a report," he said, still not looking at her directly, "that there was some disturbance here earlier this week. A visitor." "We had a traveler," Eleanor said. "He asked for shelter for the night. The weather was poor." "A traveler?" "Yes." "And he's gone now?" "He left yesterday morning," Eleanor said. "I didn't think it worth writing to you about. We shelter travelers occasionally. It's common practice in the country." Richard looked at her then, directly, the look of a man taking a measurement. She met it without moving. "Of course," he said. He smiled. She had seen that smile before. The one from her aunt's sitting room. The one that meant he had prepared for exactly this. She felt the cold of it now in a way she hadn't then. She had been 26 in that sitting room, with no money and no options and nothing to lose. She was 30 now, and she had a great deal to lose. And the smile felt entirely different from this side of 4 years. "I thought I might stay for a few days," Richard said. "Look over the accounts." "Of course," Eleanor said. "Mrs. Peel will prepare a room." James was in the north field. This had been Eleanor's arrangement, worked out in the 3 days between his arrival and Richard's, in the study, over maps of the property and long conversations conducted in low voices with the doors closed. He could not leave. Leaving meant roads, and roads meant checkpoints, and a man traveling alone who matched the description of a dead duke would not get far before Richard's people found him. He could not stay in the house. Richard would search it one way or another, with or without invitation. But the estate was large. The north field was a mile from the house. The old gamekeeper's cottage had been empty for 2 years. "It isn't comfortable," Eleanor had said. "Miss Voss," James had said, "I spent 3 years and 8 months in a French prison." She had not raised the subject of comfort again. Mrs. Peel brought food to the cottage twice a day, by a route that avoided the main paths. Tom Weller's son, 16, sharp-eyed, and possessed of the particular loyalty of someone whose family had been brought back from nothing, had been watching the gate road since dawn. Eleanor had not told James about Tom Weller's son. Some things were better not spoken aloud. Richard spent the first day reviewing the current ledgers. Eleanor sat with him. Not because he asked her to, he did not, but because she had decided, in the study 3 nights ago, that she would not leave Richard alone in this house. Not in any room that contained paper. Not for any length of time that would allow him to look for what he suspected was here. He went through the ledgers with the focused attention of a man looking for something specific. Eleanor watched him from the chair by the window, her own work open in her lap, her pen moving steadily. He did not find what he was looking for, because what he was looking for was in the linen cupboard, in a box, and the linen cupboard was locked, and the key was in Eleanor's pocket. At 4:30, he closed the ledger. "These are very thorough," he said. "I try to be accurate," Eleanor said. "You kept copies of everything, I imagine?" "I keep duplicates of all significant documents, yes. Standard practice for estate management." "And where do you keep them?" She looked up from her work, met his eyes. "In the study," she said. "In the cabinet. Would you like to see them?" A pause, barely perceptible. "Not at present," he said. He knew she was lying. She knew he knew. They both knew that neither of them could say so directly without revealing more than they wished to reveal. This was the particular dance of people who have too much information about each other and are not yet ready to use it. Eleanor went back to her work. Richard watched her for a moment longer. Then he stood and went to dress for dinner. On the second evening, Richard told her why he had really come. They were in the drawing room after dinner. A room Eleanor had barely used in 4 years, a formal room with covered furniture she had uncovered for his visit and would cover again the moment he left. Richard had a glass of brandy. Eleanor had tea. The fire was adequate. The room was still. "I've been thinking," Richard said, "about the future of the estate." Eleanor waited. "Windham has been well managed," he said. "You've done more than I expected, frankly. More than I asked." He swirled the brandy. "But the arrangement as it stands is irregular. A woman managing a ducal estate, without formal appointment, without legal standing. It invites questions." "It has invited no questions in 4 years," Eleanor said. "Not yet." He looked at the fire. "There has been some interest, recently, from certain parties, in the estate, in its status. Questions about the inheritance?" Her pulse moved. "What kind of questions?" "The legal kind," Richard said. "Someone has been making inquiries into the death certificate, into the timeline of the inheritance." He paused. "Into whether the process was entirely regular." He was watching her face. She kept it still. "That concerns me," she said carefully. "It concerns me as well," he said, "which is why I think it would be wise to formalize things between us." Eleanor looked at him. "I'm not sure I understand," she said. "I think you do," Richard said. "You are a practical woman, Miss Voss. You understand how things work. You have lived in this house for 4 years. You have managed it well. You have a position here, an informal one, but real." He set down his glass. "If you were to marry, a suitable match, someone connected to the family, your position would become formal, legal, protected." "You are suggesting," Eleanor said slowly, "that I marry someone." "I am suggesting," Richard said, that I know several men who would be glad to have a capable wife and a well-managed estate. The arrangement would be mutually beneficial. And if these legal inquiries produce anything, a married woman, Richard said, with a formal connection to the estate, is a much more stable figure than an unmarried one acting in an informal capacity. He looked at her directly. It would be much harder to question your role here. Much harder to suggest that you had been improperly involved in the estate's management. There it was. Eleanor sat with it for a moment. The shape of it. The thing he was actually saying, underneath the thing he was saying. Marry who I tell you to marry. Become legally embedded in my arrangement. And if anyone comes asking questions, you will have more to lose than I do. She looked at the fire. That is very thoughtful of you, she said. I'll consider it. Richard smiled. Don't consider it too long, he said pleasantly. These inquiries have a way of moving quickly. She went to the north field that night. The cottage was cold. The fire was banked low, just enough to keep the temperature above frost. James was at the small table with a candle and the papers Eleanor had been bringing him in batches. The older ledgers, the duplicate receipts, the payment records. He looked up when she came in. Read her face. He moved, James said. He wants me to marry someone, Eleanor said. Someone of his choosing, to formalize my connection to the estate. James was very still. So that if anyone challenges the inheritance, I become part of the arrangement, Eleanor said. Legally, visibly, undeniably. Whatever questions arise about how the estate has been managed, I answer them as his person, with everything to lose if the answers come out wrong. He's making you the shield, James said. He made me the shield 4 years ago, Eleanor said. He's just putting a frame on it. She sat down across from him. The candle was between them. Outside the window, the field was dark and very quiet. He knows someone is asking questions, she said. About the death certificate, about the inheritance timeline. James looked at the papers in front of him. My contact in London, he said. Before he died, he told me he had passed certain documents to a solicitor, someone he trusted, someone who would know what to do with them. He paused. I didn't know if it had happened. Whether he had managed it before, he stopped. It appears he did. Who is the solicitor? A man named Hartley, Gray's Inn. Eleanor opened her notebook, wrote the name. We need to reach him, she said. Yes. Without Richard knowing? Yes. They looked at each other across the candle. Tom Weller's son, Eleanor said. He's 16. He's quick. He knows the back roads to the village. James looked at her. You have a 16-year-old boy watching the gate, he said. He volunteered, Eleanor said. His family's cottage was one of the ones Richard had cleared. I brought them back. James said nothing for a moment. Miss Voss, he said. Yes. When I came to this door 4 nights ago, I had no plan beyond getting inside without Richard's people seeing me. I had no evidence beyond a deed and a ring. I had no allies, no legal standing, no money, and no way to prove I was alive to anyone who mattered. He looked at the papers spread across the table. And then you opened the door. Eleanor looked at the candle. I almost didn't, she said. I know, he said. I heard you hesitate. The fire shifted. Somewhere outside an owl called once and was silent. There is something I have to tell you, James said. His voice had changed. The careful, factual tone he had used for 4 nights of conversation. Gone. What was underneath it was quieter and more careful in a different way. Eleanor waited. "Richard," he said, "did not choose you at random." She looked at him. "When he came to your aunt's house," James said, "he knew who you were. Not because you were a distant relative. Because of your father." "My father," Eleanor said slowly, "died owing 2 debts. One of them," James said, "was to Richard." The candle flame moved in a draft from somewhere. Eleanor watched it straighten. "How much?" she said. "Enough," James said, "that Richard owned the right to call it in at any time, against you, against your aunt, who had co-signed without fully understanding what she was signing." He paused. "He came to your aunt's house not to offer you a position, Miss Voss. He came to collect a debt, and he decided that sending you to Windham was more useful to him than collecting it." Eleanor sat very still. She thought of her aunt's face the morning Richard arrived, the way Harriet had swept the newspaper away, the way she had ushered Richard into the sitting room with a speed and deference that Eleanor had attributed, at the time, to social anxiety. It had not been social anxiety. Harriet had known he was coming. Harriet had known why. "My aunt," Eleanor said. Her voice was perfectly level. "She knew. She knew he was coming," James said carefully. "I don't believe she knew the full extent of what he had planned. But she knew the debt. And she knew he had the right to call it in." Eleanor thought about 2 years at Harriet's table. Every meal, every fire, every dress borrowed. The unspoken ledger. The debt that was never named but always present. It had been named. She simply hadn't been told what it was. "She let him take me," Eleanor said. Not a question. James did not answer, which was its own answer. She walked back to the house alone. The field was dark, the path familiar under her feet after 4 years. She could have walked it blind. The house was ahead of her, the windows lit. Richard's shadow moving behind the drawing room curtain. She stopped in the middle of the path. She stood there in the cold dark and she let herself feel it. All of it. The full weight of it. The things she had been managing and organizing and filing away in notebooks for 4 years without allowing herself to name. Her father's debt. Her aunt's complicity. Richard's calculation. The document he had covered with his hand. The salary he had cut. The man he had sent to review the books. She had been moved. From her aunt's house to this estate, like a piece on a board. Selected for her silence. Positioned for her usefulness. Kept in place by a debt she hadn't known existed. Every choice she had believed was hers. The pen she had picked up. The contract she had signed. The door she had walked through. Had been laid out for her in advance by a man who had decided she was the right kind of woman for his purposes. The right kind. Quiet. Grateful. Too precarious to ask questions. She stood in the dark field, and she felt it move through her. Not grief, not quite. Something harder than grief. Something that had no name but sat in the chest like iron. Then she picked up her candle and walked back to the house. Richard found the box on Friday morning. She had moved it. She had known she would need to, eventually. And she had moved it 2 days before his arrival to a place she was confident he wouldn't find. But on Friday morning, Mrs. Peel came to the study with a look on her face that said something had gone wrong. And Eleanor went to the linen cupboard, and the box was gone. She stood at the empty shelf for a long moment. Then she went to the window and looked out at the drive. Richard's carriage was being prepared. She understood. He had found the box. He had seen what was in it. He had made his decision. He was leaving before she could do anything with what she knew. And once he was back in London, with the box. With 4 years of records that she had carefully compiled and he could now use against her, the balance shifted entirely in his favor. She had perhaps 2 hours. She went to the study. She sat at the desk. She opened the notebook she had been keeping since James arrived, the new one, with his account in her handwriting, the names and dates and paper trail she had spent 4 nights assembling. She looked at it. She thought about what it would cost. To hand this to Hartley, to send Tom Weller's son to London with this notebook, meant Richard could no longer use her silence as a shield. It meant the inquiry would proceed. It meant James would have a chance. It also meant that everything in the original box, the unauthorized expenditures, the decisions made without permission, the 5 families, the South Wing, the accounts she had spent without asking, would be examined. And Richard would make certain they were examined as unfavorably as possible. She would lose the estate. Obviously, she had never owned it. She might lose more than that. She looked at the stopped watch on the windowsill. She picked up her pen. She wrote a letter to Hartley of Gray's Inn Road, London. She wrote it in the careful, clear handwriting she had spent 4 years using in ledgers and correspondence and duplicate receipts. She wrote the names: James Ashworth, Richard Ashworth, Captain Fallow, Graves. She wrote the dates. She wrote the quarterly payments. She wrote everything James had told her, and everything she had seen, and everything she had, without knowing it, been accumulating for 4 years. She folded it, sealed it, wrote the address. Then she wrote a second letter, shorter. Dear Aunt Harriet, I have recently come to understand the nature of my father's debt and the manner in which it was settled. I do not write to accuse you. I write only to tell you that I know, so that you need not carry the weight of my not knowing any longer. I am well. I have been, in my way, fortunate. Eleanor. She folded that one too, did not seal it, looked at it for a moment. Then she sealed it. She called for Tom Weller's son. He left within the hour. Both letters and the duplicate of the notebook she had made the previous night, copied in her own hand by candlelight between midnight and 4 in the morning, because some part of her had known this moment was coming. She had not told James what she was doing. She told him after. He was in the cottage. She came in without knocking and set the copy of the notebook on the table in front of him. I've sent the originals to Hartley, she said. Everything. Your account, the payment records, the names. Tom left an hour ago. James looked at the notebook, then at her. Richard found the box, she said. He's leaving this morning. Once he's in London with those records, he controls the timeline. We had to move first. Miss Voss, James said, if Richard tells the court those records were improperly kept, if he suggests you were acting without authority, he will, Eleanor said. I know. You could lose. I know what I could lose, she said. She said it quietly, not sharply, simply as a fact she had already accounted for. I was never going to keep this house, she said. It was never mine. I knew that when I arrived, and I knew it every day after. She looked at the window, at the north field beyond it, at the gray November sky. But I built something here, and I kept records of it. And the records are true. She looked back at him. That's what I have. That's what I can give to Hartley. And it's enough. James looked at her for a long time. Why? He said. Are you doing this? Eleanor considered the question seriously, the way she considered all questions she asked herself. Because your brother, she said, sent me here to be quiet and useful and ask nothing. And I was. For 4 years, I was exactly what he needed. She paused. I'm finished with that. Richard left Windham at noon. Eleanor watched the carriage from the upstairs window. She watched it move down the long drive between the elms she had arranged to have trimmed in the spring of her 2nd year. She watched it pass through the gate. She watched it disappear. Mrs. Peel came to stand beside her. They watched the empty drive together for a moment. He took the box, Eleanor said. I know, said Mrs. Peel. I put it where he'd find it. Eleanor turned to look at her. Mrs. Peel's expression was entirely composed. You put it... Eleanor stopped. Mrs. Peel. The box he found, Mrs. Peel said, contained 4 years of household accounts, shopping receipts, correspondence about the drains. She paused. I assumed you had moved the real box before his arrival. You're a thorough woman. I thought it likely. Eleanor stared at her. I have worked in this house, Mrs. Peel said, for 31 years. I knew his father. I knew him as a boy. She looked out at the drive. I have been waiting a very long time for someone to come and do something about what Richard Ashworth did. Eleanor looked at the empty drive. You could have told me, she said. Any time in 4 years? Could I? Said Mrs. Peel. Would you have believed me? Eleanor thought about it honestly. No, she said. No, Mrs. Peel agreed. You needed to see it yourself. The inquiry opened in January. Hartley was a precise, unhurried man who had been waiting, it emerged, for exactly the kind of documentation Eleanor had sent him. He had the documents from James's contact in London, the ones passed before the man's death, but they had been incomplete. What Eleanor sent completed them. Richard's solicitor, Graves, was questioned first. Then the estate records. All of them, including the box Richard had taken from Windham, which turned out to contain, as Mrs. Peel had arranged, 4 years of shopping receipts and correspondence about drains. Richard had spent the journey to London believing he had Eleanor's evidence. He had arrived to find he had her grocery lists. Captain Fallow was dead, but Fallow's account was not. Hartley found it. The quarterly payments, £40, first of every month, from an account held in Richard's name through an intermediary firm in Bristol. The payments matched Eleanor's records exactly. Date for date, pound for pound. James gave his testimony in February. Eleanor sat in the gallery. She had been asked to testify as well, about the records, about the box, about the decisions she had made without formal authority over 4 years. She had expected this to be the worst of it. It was not as bad as Richard had intended. Because Hartley, who was precise and unhurried and had read every word she had sent him, had organized her testimony in a particular way. Not the decisions she had made, but the results. The drainage, the families, the south wing, the accounts corrected, the estate's income in 1843 against 1847. Miss Voss, Hartley said, in 4 years of management, did the estate's annual income increase or decrease? Increase, Eleanor said, by approximately 40%. And the number of tenant families on the property increased from 14 to 22. And the outstanding debts to local tradesmen reduced to 0 by the end of my second year. Hartley nodded and moved to his next question. Richard's advocate tried to make the unauthorized expenditures into something. Eleanor answered each question directly and without elaboration. The drainage cost less than the crop losses it prevented. The south wing repair had been funded from an account Richard had overlooked. The families had paid their rents. The records proved it. She did not apologize for any of it. The judgment came in March. James Ashworth was declared legally alive. The death certificate of 1843 was ruled fraudulent. The inheritance was reversed. Richard Ashworth was ordered to account for all assets transferred, sold, or disposed of during his administration of the estate. Richard was not arrested. Eleanor had known he would not be. This was 1848. Richard had money and connections and a name and a seat in the House of Lords that his brief dukedom had secured. The machinery that protected men like Richard Ashworth from the full consequences of what they did was older than Eleanor and would outlast her, and had not been built to bend for anyone who lacked a sufficient title. He was ordered to make financial restitution. He was quietly removed from certain committees. He was, within a year, appointed to a colonial administrative post in a place far enough away that his presence would not inconvenience anyone. That was how justice worked in 1848. Quietly. And always in favor of the right surname. Eleanor read the judgment in Hartley's office. She read it carefully, the way she read everything, to the last line. Then she folded it and handed it back to Hartley. "Is there anything else you need from me?" she asked. "No," said Hartley. "I think that will do very well, Miss Voss." She picked up her coat. She stood. "Miss Voss," Hartley said. She looked back. "In 30 years of practice," he said, "I have rarely encountered records as thorough as the ones you kept. Without them," he paused, "without them, I'm not certain we could have done this." Eleanor looked at him. "I kept records," she said, "because something was wrong and I wanted to be able to prove it." "Yes," said Hartley. "But most people in your position would have kept their heads down and hoped it resolved itself." Eleanor thought about this. "I kept my head down," she said. "I just kept my pen moving at the same time." She left. She went back to Windham once. Not to stay. James had asked her formally, with the careful directness of a man who has learned not to assume anything, and she had considered it for a long time and said no. Not because she didn't want to. She had wanted to, in the complicated way of wanting things that are right for the wrong reasons or wrong for the right ones, and she had not trusted that wanting. She went back in April, when the elms were just beginning. She walked the property once, all of it, every field, every cottage, every outbuilding, the way she had walked it in the first week 4 years ago. She said goodbye to the people she had brought back, the children she had watched grow, the fields she had learned by name. Tom Weller's son walked part of the way with her, in the easy silence of someone who had carried letters to London and back and understood that some things didn't need to be spoken. She went into the south wing study. She stood at the window. She looked at the bookshelf. The poetry volume was still there. James Ashworth, 1836. She left it exactly where it was. On the desk she had sat at for 4 years, through 4 winters and 4 springs, Through the long nights of ledgers and the longer nights of uncertainty, she left two things. Her notebook, the last one, finished, and her father's stopped watch. She did not leave a note. There was nothing she needed to say that wasn't already written down. She was at the gate when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. James was coming down the drive. He had been working. His coat was dusty, his sleeves rolled, the look of a man who had spent the morning doing something physical and useful. He stopped a few feet from her. They looked at each other. "The Northfield drainage," he said. "Daniel Marsh sends his regards." "Tell him it was his idea," Eleanor said. "I just arranged it." James looked at her, at the gate, at the road beyond it. "You don't have to go," he said. "I know," she said. Then, "I know," she said again more gently. "But I spent 4 years in someone else's life. I'd like to try one of my own." He was quiet for a moment. "Where will you go?" She had thought about this. She had an answer, which she had arrived at over the long winter months in Hartley's waiting room and the long evenings in her London lodgings, reading the case papers and copying and recopying until she could recite them in her sleep. "Hartley needs someone," she said, "for the records work, the document management." He said, if I was interested. James looked at her. "You're going to work for a solicitor?" "I'm going to organize a solicitor's records," Eleanor said, "which is what I have been doing for 4 years without the title." Something moved across his face. The expression she had first seen in the doorway on the night he came back. The one she had spent months learning to read. It was not quite a smile. It was the look of a man watching something happen that he had not expected and found, unexpectedly, to be right. "The watch," he said. "On the desk." "It needs repairing," she said. "I never got around to it." "I'll have it repaired," he said. "If you want it back." She looked at him. "Keep it running," she said. "That's all." She went through the gate. The road was long, and the morning was cold, and the elms were coming into leaf above the drive behind her. And she did not look back. Not because it hurt to look back, but because there was, for the first time in a very long time, more ahead of her than behind. The Duke of Windham was legally resurrected on a Tuesday morning in March of 1848. His brother was appointed to an administrative post in Calcutta 4 months later. No one was arrested. No one ever is. Eleanor Voss began work at Hartley & Associates, Gray's Inn, on the 1st of May. She reorganized their entire filing system within 6 weeks. Hartley called it the finest piece of administrative work he had seen in 30 years of practice. She did not disagree. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Don't forget to tell us which city you're watching from.